Then There's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus discussing their lives, legislative priorities, policies, and other issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. There are many on both sides of the abortion debate in this country who anticipate that come July of this year, the Supreme Court will have overturned Roe v. Wade, and with it, the constitutional reproductive right to abortion, which has been part of our lives and a freedom of choice for so many women for 5 decades. And across much of the U.S., as we speak, many states aren't waiting for the high court to rule. Florida, Idaho, Oklahoma, and of course Texas, where the Supreme Court allowed a law to take effect that puts abortion restriction enforcement in the hands of private citizen vigilantes, they are all moving along as if Roe had already been struck down, advancing new policies that aim to outlaw abortion entirely in as many circumstances as possible, and offering us a glimpse of what is soberly being called a post-Roe America. But that's not what's happening here in California. Our state, thankfully, has some of the strongest reproductive pro-choice rights in the U.S., including a right to privacy enshrined in our state's Constitution. And California's progressive leaders are continuing to fortify our efforts to protect every woman's right to choose and to truly be a reproductive freedom state for everybody, proposing policies to secure our state's reproductive rights infrastructure, so to speak, and continuing to offer medical services, safe haven, sanctuary, to women from other states who are seeing those reproductive rights erode in their home communities. And in fact, one of those progressive California leaders committed to ensuring reproductive rights access in our state, while also continuing to bear witness to the stories of those women seeking legal reproductive health care, is in fact the leader of the California State Senate, the Honorable Toni G. Atkins. Senator Atkins, as you know, is not only the first member of the LGBTQ community to serve as Senate Pro Tem and formerly as Speaker of the State Assembly, but also the first woman to serve in this leadership capacity here in the Senate. She represents the 39th Senate District down in beautiful San Diego County, but simultaneously is also looking out for the best interests of all Californians, and we are glad to have her back on Then There's California, especially as we speak during Women's History Month. Madam Pro Tem, welcome back.
Wow, thank you, Brian. It's always good to be here.
How are you? How's life in San Diego and the family and the pets and everybody?
San Diego is great, and Mia and Joey are wonderful, and it's good to be back in Sacramento, and we're busy. We're busy. It's,
oh, my gosh,
we're in March, Women's History Month, but also the time when our bills start to go into print and we start to hear those things, so...
When we talked about Pride of 2021, we were talking about coming out of the shutdown from COVID, and knock on wood, it'll stay that way. And you were talking about baking pies.
Yes.
And you mentioned egg custard pies.
Yes.
And this is what inquiring minds want to know here. How's the pie baking going? Do you have any time for it? And in your honor and name, I last fall tried to bake an egg custard pie. Didn't turn out too bad. Maybe a little nutmeg.
Brian, I'll
but
make you one.
Okay.
Make you one. I'm still finding time to do that. And but at the same time, you know, I am hopeful. We're coming out of this pandemic, as you said, knock on wood. We remain flexible and able to pivot and fluid in terms of what we may have to do here in the Capitol so we can continue to do the legislative business of the people.
Well, going into this year, even as COVID appears on the wane, any glance at the world right now reminds us that we are living really in some sobering and humbling times.
So true, Brian. I think that sort of adds to what we're seeing, not just the pandemic, but so many things happening in the world. In California, we've been battling wildfires and drought and floods, obviously the pandemic. And this Women's History Month, I think in how you opened this show to talk about the threat to abortion and reproductive rights in this country, you know, there is some hope in California, as you indicated, because we do have as our core value the right to privacy and support for reproductive rights for all. And you're going to see us continue to be a beacon and at the forefront of making that possible, not just for Californians, but for women who may want to come here.
Well, the enactment of SB 8 in Texas last fall and the growing number of oppressive anti-abortion measures being introduced and enacted across the country, as I talked about, and then the Supreme Court's anticipated and feared overturn via the Dobbs v. Jackson case of Roe's existing rights here may have really told us all we need to know about the future of reproductive rights access in this country, unfolding like a Margaret Atwood novel, except it's not fiction in this case. So give us some more reaction to what you think's happening in this country.
This is not new for us to face this battle. In fact, it was probably the greatest fear of those of us who for decades have continued to monitor and look out for reproductive rights and freedom across the country and in California. The fear of a conservative majority Supreme Court has come to fruition. And you see that bolstered by Republican or right-winged legislatures who are taking advantage of that in order to push back our rights. But we've been here before, and we don't intend to not fight to make sure we retain those rights. And California, as a beacon, as a sanctuary, as a safe haven, I loved all of those phrases that you started with, will make sure that we can be that for others as well. We've been in this place before. That's how I started my career, and so I have some history and experience, which is why this is one of the most important issues for me personally as well as professionally.
Well, I was going to lead into this and say a landscape we feared, but you say we've been through this before, and so really perhaps it's not a landscape that we fear as California becomes this refuge for reproductive rights and health care for women coming from other states to seek abortion protection and abortion services here, and there's a concern about it being overwhelmed by this onslaught of women that are coming. We've heard stories of women in other states and even coming here to California. They come into the exam room with suitcases, and then they're ready to turn around and go back to the airport or their cars. And you probably heard the story from last fall of this gynecologist obstetrician in Oakland who goes to Texas a couple of times a month and sets up shop for the weekend to help women who are there who can't get services in their own state.
Brian, we've been there before. When I was in the early to mid 80s, a clinic director of 2 women's clinics in San Diego and Los Angeles, we saw women from Mexico. We saw women from other states where there were more restrictive laws. I met a mother who lost her daughter to an illegal abortion. I held the hand of military women who couldn't get access to the procedure on a military base hospital. So we have been there before. I think the difference is we thought we had made such strides, and here we are facing this again. Women are already coming to California because of what's happening across the country. And I think what for us last fall was providers and advocates coming together to say we need to evaluate California's ability to do more than we are currently doing. We have it ingrained in our Constitution, but do we have the services readily available in California? And we know that we have some issues and some concerns that we need to address. So the Future of Abortion Council came into being of advocates and practitioners to assess and determine what our plan going forward would be to help be prepared for that.
Well, let's dig into that a little bit. The Legislative Women's Caucus, you yourself have introduced legislation at the behest and the recommendation of these different organizations and services to help women and to shore up what California is offering in terms of these services, not only to women coming in, but women who are already here. Talk about some of that, including your bills.
Absolutely. Well, we also know that there is a lack of providers throughout the state of California. So while we have it ingrained in our Constitution and the right to privacy, it really is also about access. And over the last decade, we've worked on some of those issues. We have state funding that provides coverage for abortion care or pregnancy-related care and family planning, the full range of that, reproductive rights and justice for all. We need more providers. So in 2013, I did a piece of legislation, AB 154, which allowed nurse practitioners, certified nurse midwives, and physician's assistants to be able to do abortions, first trimester abortions, with doctor supervision to increase the pool of providers. A couple of years ago, in 2020, you saw Assemblymember Wood do an Assembly Bill 890, which basically talked about expanding the pool of providers to do primary care, nurse practitioners. So the bill that I've introduced this year, 1375, really brings together those 2 pieces of legislation and allows nurse practitioners to do abortions without the supervision of a doctor, of course requiring training and experience, but it broadens the pool to try to deal with that workforce issue of lack of access throughout our state.
The governor in his State of the State address last night, as we speak, talked about the California way, dealing with diversity and innovative solutions in the wake of divisiveness and authoritarian impulses. So this clearly falls under that category, if you will, of the California way, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's why you see the Women's Legislative Caucus stepping up with more than almost a dozen pieces of legislation to hit every aspect of what we need to do. My bill is one piece of that. But we do want to make sure that we are increasing access. And so I think that is a key issue now. Again, I said we've already seen women coming here from other states, and we want to be prepared to provide the quality of care. And in my bill, in the case of 1375, I think it's really important that we use the full range of experience of practitioners who will be able to provide that quality of care to women.
Can we afford logistically, fiscally, and otherwise to be a sanctuary state?
We already provide health care. I mentioned Medi-Cal for pregnancy-related issues as well as abortion. For decades, as I started, I told you about my history as a director of clinic services. Mm-hmm. There has always been philanthropy available, working with providers to make sure that there are dollars to help those women who may not have the resources. It shouldn't be that you where you live or that you have money, that you have access to quality health care for any service, but particularly something as time sensitive as needing to get an abortion. And so that always has existed. And I think California will find more and more ways to be supportive. But there's clearly a private piece of this. And it's a call to action, if you will, mm-hmm. to those of us who've been longtime supporters of reproductive rights, that we have to double down and step forward and make sure that we, along with what government can provide in the way of health care, will be there to also help.
Taking a point that you just made, there are still concerns that many patients already here in California face a stark abortion access landscape. They live in areas where there are no abortion providers, especially in parts of California's Central Valley, where we find many women of color and families living below the poverty line have no access to services. I assume these kind of bills that you're talking about are addressing that gap in California.
Seeking to address that gap as well, a lot of what was discussed was workforce issues, which was the impetus for my bill, 1375. When I understood from this conversation with the Future of Abortion Council that the bill that I had authored in 2013 was good, but we still had issues in that there weren't enough nurse practitioners who could act. So taking a step further with AB 890 to make sure that nurse practitioners can act under their own authority without doctor supervision, hopefully will expand access. Not just for abortion services, again, but for primary care.
You talked about being the Director of Clinical Services in San Diego and the deep honor that you felt in being in that, as you've said, unique position to ensure access to abortion rights in California, and that it's part of a passion and a compassion that has deep roots in your political and professional and personal life. We have, of course, talked about your coming here from Appalachia to come to California, but talk about how you got into the clinic and the work that you did there and how it lit the fire or prompted you to continue on with your career even outside those doors.
Well, thank you for that question. I went to interview for a job at a clinic for a communications position, and I couldn't get in the building. I didn't realize it was, I knew it was a feminist women's clinic, but mm-hmm. I didn't realize that day, obviously there was abortion procedures were happening that particular day, and I couldn't get in the clinic. And I came away just absolutely furious that someone would try to stop an individual from accessing health care. And so I was determined to work for that organization. And I actually ended up, through training and additional work, becoming the clinic manager. And that was an incredible experience. I learned so much from those dedicated, incredible providers who were putting everything on the line to provide a service that they felt was so important for women and their families. And I remember one time a military woman serving in the Navy in San Diego, came to our clinic, and I got to be with her during the procedure, and I was making sure to provide the advocacy and everything she needed. And she started to ask me some interesting questions. And as it turned out, she really didn't want an abortion. She was there because she had herpes, which is something that can be embarrassing to someone. But she thought she had to have an abortion because the baby
Wow.
would be impacted by a sexually transmitted disease.
Wow.
And once I gathered that, I brought the doctor in, and we were able to tell her, not necessarily, you can deliver a healthy baby. As it turns out, he was a physician that worked at Balboa Naval Hospital and would come help us as well. And he later delivered a very healthy baby to her. So, those stories, and I mentioned the woman whose daughter I met who died at age 17 because she couldn't get an abortion without her parental consent, and she didn't want to disappoint her parents. Those are stories I've never forgotten. Mm-hmm. That if individuals don't have access to quality health care, what can happen? And so I learned a lot in those years, and it really fueled my passion to make sure and do everything I can to increase access. Of course, then I did not know I would be a legislator or the president pro tem of the Senate, but I continue to make sure that this is core to the work that I do.
As you tell these stories, it again reminds me of the phrase I used in the opening about your opportunity, or the privilege, I guess you have, of bearing witness to these stories, that's as much a part of this as the laws and the regulations and the limitations and the opportunities and the access. It's bearing witness to these stories of particularly women back in the 70s and 80s and 90s who dealt with so much of the fear and the secrecy and the unsafety. Explain more about that.
Well, it is a privilege, and real stories, real people's lives and real stories matter. And I think in terms of legislation, that's what I try to hold on to, whether we're talking about health care or affordable housing or any education, access to education. Those are the stories that resonate, that help you create legislation that really will make a difference in people's lives.
Is there more that California, more that progressives, women's choice organizations should have done, could have done over the last couple of decades to lock in these rights that were afforded by Roe v. Wade, so we wouldn't be in this position right now on the precipice of a conservative court that's ready to gut it?
I think we have. I think we've continued to fight the good fight. We haven't given up. And there are many of us who were in states or lived before Roe versus Wade, and we know the impact of not having these protections. So we've continued to monitor. We've never stepped away from reminding people this could be taken away from us. We watched as we saw the court start to turn, and an administration who came to power and was able to appoint more conservative justices. So I think we continue to do the work. And we will continue to do the work. I strive for a point in time where young people can take it for granted that it is a given that they are going to have access to health care, including reproductive health care and abortion.
Well, those young women who are coming of age right now in this time when perhaps their sisters, their aunts, their mothers, even their grandmothers had access to this right, had the comfort of this right, this must be kind of a shock to them to see what perhaps they took for granted in their young lives now to be sacrificed. What do you say to them? Do you encourage them that they got to fight tooth and nail as much as the other side is doing?
I think these young folks are not naive, and I think they're determined. And I think when we saw a presidential candidate bragging about groping women publicly, as we've watched mass shootings over the last decade, trans people of color being killed in alarming numbers, racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, sexism continues. I already mentioned the global pandemic and some of the things we're struggling with here in California. But as I think you see these things, the reaction is protests in the streets, women's marches that occurred almost immediately, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, running for office at younger and younger ages and winning. I think that's a reaction and a determination that we're going to be engaged. Young people are engaged. Again, I don't think they're naive. I think they're determined, and I think they will make a difference. We will make a difference.
Absolutely. Can we also change the attitude about how we view women who are pregnant, their right to choice, even their very sense of self? How do we change that attitude as well?
Well, that's a culture shift, much like we talk about now so many things through an equity lens. We're starting to talk about housing as something that was withheld from communities of color. We are talking about sexism differently. The Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement are examples of changing culture. We also have to see this as it relates to women who may need abortion, individuals who need that. There has been a stigma related to abortion for decades. Doctors really penalized if they did the procedure or looked down upon as if they weren't, as good as other doctors. I mean, that's a culture and that's a mentality that has been pushed and promoted. And so part of this is culture shift and change that needs to happen so that there will be people who want to be providers, who want to help people get the full range of medical quality care. The last thing I would say, Brian, is just I think we need to remember that there's no finish line for progress because it's ever evolving, and it would be my hope that that's the message we carry forward.
That's beautiful. We will carry that forward. Thank you for all the work that you've done, for the place you are right now to influence this conversation and this policy, your advocacy, your continued bearing of witness, and wishing you a successful year with all of this. And let's do this again sometime.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian.
Glad to have you here. And with that, folks, we close this edition of Then There's California. We're a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus with technical and production assistance from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, and Rainier Sabiniano, John Roman, McClina Woods, Lisa Murphy, and the graphic artistry of Tim Davis. On behalf of the boss, Senate Pro Tem Toni Atkins of San Diego, I'm Brian Green at the State Capitol in Sacramento. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.